Hello, everyone. Welcome to season 2 of Bios and Bookmarks, an online reading series with Caribbean authors hosted by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I'm Shivani Ramlochan, and I'm really excited about this season, and especially excited about our first guest, who I'm not ashamed to say has been a huge favorite of mine for a long time. Please join me in welcoming Barbadian author Karen Lord. Karen, it's so good to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Shivani. It's so good to be here.
Karen is the author of several best-selling speculative fiction novels, the most recent of which is right here on display for you to see, called Unraveling, and it was released in 2019 by DAW Books. Unraveling is more than slightly related to Karen's first book, Redemption in Indigo, in that if you're lucky enough to have read that book, and I hope that you have, you will find familiar faces and places echoing across both novels. And I'm really excited to hear Karen read from her work. So she is going to launch us into Unraveling, which is a spectacularly mysterious book in so many ways with a reading. So Karen.
Okay, so I'm actually going to start you at the very beginning, and it may still seem as if you don't quite know what's happening, but just roll with me. Chapter 1. A chorus of tree frogs trilled in the damp velvet darkness, wide awake and relentless as they spoke their authority over the nocturnal world. The village of Makenda slowly marked the hours to midnight with a quieting of laughter and argument, a dimming and darkening, and a staccato punctuation of ending sounds, the shutting of doors, the dropping of shoes, and the weighty hush of a house empty of talk but filled with dreaming. One house kept vigil with a single glowing window. Behind the curtains of pale ivory gauze, gilded by the light of an oil lamp, an age-old scene was unfolding. A mother of the village sitting at the kitchen table, interrogating her adult son about his life, his loves, and his future. Because the mother was Palma, a woman known for quiet strength and infinite patience, the conversation was calm and loving rather than sharp and resentful. Because the son was Yao, also known as Chance, one of the undying who had become human more by accident than design, questions that involved love and the future were difficult to answer. Such is the lot of mortals who birth myth and legend in the midst of the mundane. At last you come to visit your old mother. Strong, patient, but not at all above a little emotional manipulation. Chance, occasionally called Yao, smiled fondly. I have been busy, you know that, Ma. Your trickster brother is the wanderer, not you. Why so vague about what you're doing? Who is she, this woman that you're working for? I don't keep secrets from you, Ma, you know that. But sometimes things are simply incomplete. She studied him in the lamplight. I will try to understand. I know you have always been unique. Unique? You had two of us, Chance reminded her teasingly. Two undying ones turned human for the privilege of being your sons. Palma shook her head. Silly boy. I would have to be very old and dotish to forget what your brother is, but you are something beyond even him. A mother always knows her child. Chance did not dwell on those times when he had been a capricious, otherworldly creature, rather than a dutiful human son. And yet, there were days when he remembered as vividly as nightmare, the moment when Patience, his elder and superior, and as much a mother as an undying one could be, took him and unraveled his essence, all but unmaking him to make him human. Growing up, Palmer's son had been a long, slow awakening from near oblivion to deep self-knowledge. With Palmer as his mother and the trickster as his brother, mortal life was not hard. It was even sweet. And yet, it felt like it wasn't enough. Sometimes things are incomplete. The beginning of one person's tale may be for another a middle or an end. All these finished and unfinished tales with neither crick nor crack to bookend them make a story and, more than a story, a history. Palmer took up the teapot, poured for herself, and offered with a gesture to refresh his half-full, cooling cup. He answered with a shake of the head and his hand over the rim. I must stay awake. I have somewhere to be later tonight. Vague again, his mother chided. Don't act as if I don't know you. Give me something, a name. Chance pondered. He knew that his mother worried about him, perhaps even more than she worried about his brother, although she would never say so. She had the same concerns as other ordinary parents. Was he happy? Was he prospering? Was there someone to take care of him when she was gone? A name, he mused. Very well. Her name is Miranda. It was midnight in Makenda, and two figures were in conversation near the well. This was a common enough scene, except for the time of night and the nature of the individuals. They were similar enough in size to stand comfortably side by side, but after that, all resemblance ended. One mimicked humanity in both attire and attitude, but his ordinary white cotton tunic and trousers, so like a peasant farmer's, contrasted with his fantastical bluish purple skin. The other made no effort to appear human at all, remaining a blur of wings and eyes, spinning through a multidimensional topography accessible only to immortals and theoretical physicists. We are sure you understand why we called you in to handle this situation, said the angel. It is the question of the human element in conjunction with the undying element. You are reputed to be an expert. The undying one, son of Palmer, who sometimes allowed himself to be called Chance, looked uncomfortable. Awkward, very awkward. I prefer if you dealt with it at your level, but I suppose you have your reasons. Yes, said the angel, we do. It could have been a rebuke, a reassurance, or simply a mild joke. It was not only the tone that was ambiguous. The double meaning inherent in the angelic plural added another layer of intent and interpretation. Chance found that some angels, particularly those who were closer to the human world, accepted the limits of communication and enjoyed being inscrutable. Still, being inscrutable to him, giving his far greater capacity for understanding, was something of a nose tweak. Uriel will take over from us, the angel continued. It is their department, after all. Furthermore, they are a little easier on mortal eyes. And, just a warning, watch out for the other side. They are unusually invested in this. We think they are intrigued. A rare expression of worry crossed Chance's face. You do not expect me to... No, not at all. Only be aware, be careful. It can be hard to tell us apart. You know what it can be like among the undying ones. We are not so different from you. Chance gave him a disbelieving look. It is only a difference in scope, the angel explained. They flashed, fluttered, and vanished abruptly, having said all that was needed. Chance raised his eyebrows in instinctive surprise. Farewells were such a human habit, but one to which he had grown too accustomed. He shook off his feeling of foreboding and concentrated on the details of his duty, a trick that required him to focus all of his attention on a point in the present so that the probabilities would emerge clearly. What he saw made him smile. He understood why the angel had been so teasingly secretive. Is it that sort of time already? He mused, the human idiom rolling off the tip of his tongue as easily as a line from a childhood memory or a phrase from a future assured. He knew where to go. The old sense of duty was like a compass, taking him to the opportune point in the paisley patterned tapestry of space and time, avoiding that straight thread that was his human life. The city was his destination, a place well known to him in its incarnations as war fortress, pirate refuge, and living museum. He emerged beside an intersection that was tangled in a writhing snarl of human and mechanical travel trails. No one noted him, but he was alert, searching for a figure that would be so familiar. There she was, Miranda. That's it for now.
Thank you so much for that, Karen.
Thank you.
It's admittedly difficult to not get completely caught up in your readings. I think I've been doing this since the first time I heard you read at, I believe it was the very first festival when you were reading from Redemption and Indigo. And I have to tell you, it's only gotten worse. That is better since then.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Unraveling is a phenomenal book. It occurs to me that it's at once the book that you can least predict, and increasingly in these strange times, exactly the book that you might need in your life.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who are just joining us, welcome again to Bios and Bookmarks, where we are coming to you live from the Writer Center, which is the home of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest in Trinidad. And of course, Karen is joining us from her home in Barbados. Karen, as we move into discussing Unraveling, it occurs to me that the hybrid nature of your writing has always been so apparent to me. Your books are identifiably science fiction or speculative fiction, but they are always doing so much more work than one thing, one genre, or one state of being. That's absolutely the case with Unraveling, which is at once a detective story, a grisly series of crime scenes, a confrontation between humanity and divinity. So when the first thread of Unraveling, I'm sorry, that's not meant to be a terrible pun. That first thread came to you with the concept of the book. Which of those did it feel like first?
You know, I'll be perfectly honest. Although I do enjoy the crime genre and have grown up as much on the Agatha Christie's and the Dorothy L. Sayers and all the rest of it, I don't think that it was my intention to write a detective story, a crime story. And in fact, when the marketing department at DAW Books thought they should bring it to the attention of some crime reviewers, at first I was very unsure. I was like, no, this is going to be a bait and switch for them. They're going to come into this expecting a normal crime novel, and then I'm going to drop angels on them and all kinds of nonsense, and they'll be mad at me. I was wrong. I was quite wrong. They did indeed like it, and they saw it as a subversion, because the Miranda that I mentioned in the reading, she is the human-based kind of investigator, forensic therapist, who is looking at paper files and dealing with a very mundane situation that she thinks is a mundane situation. But the real investigators are two supernatural beings. And you're very much immersed in the otherworldly point of view. So it is in a way a subversion where instead of there's a completely human viewpoint and then strange things happen, it's almost as if the otherworldly viewpoint is the norm, and the things that the humans do, those are the things that are a bit strange. And I guess that is something I do like doing. As you say, the kind of the clash between, as it were, humanity and divinity or what have you. The ways in which we have similarities and the ways in which we have differences are not always the ways that we think. So to play with that is something that's fascinating to me.
It's so good to feel with Unraveling that there is a kind of homecoming to the threads and elements and people that we met in Redemption and Indigo. Did you think that those bonds were always going to be apparent to the reader? Because while they're there, and without wanting to give too much away, I think if readers go into Unraveling expecting a stereotypical or prototypical sequel, it might not be what they get.
You've actually raised the challenge that I had to think through, because yes, it's an answer to Redemption. Redemption left a question unanswered, the question of the very title itself. How is Chance going to redeem himself? But the tone of the sequel, which I could not control, and I tried. I thought, I need to let this be, of a piece of Redemption and Indigo. They can read them side by side, and it's perfectly fine. But no, Redemption was always like a folk tale, very much like the children's story that I read, something you can read out loud to your 5-year-old and not traumatize them. And instead, for a sequel, I was, writing all kinds of grisly things. So I thought that even though there was a risk in doing that little gap between one book and the other, I felt almost compelled to do so, because I felt it would be more traumatizing to stick them both together and have such a radical shift in what you can expect from the story. I do, however, want to point out that both stories are inspirations from my primary school years. Redemption, as I said, is the story of that folktale that I read in the children's encyclopedia that I loved. But the murders in Unraveling are something that was happening when I was in primary school. We had this urban legend / news report of someone called the Heart Man who drove around in a hearse and would kidnap you, and basically your heart would be cut out. So there was this element of kind of serial killer plus a nasty little supernatural element of what is he doing with the body parts. And there's an aspect of that where when you're a child, of course, there are things your parents try to hide from you. So there are things that they will not necessarily be discussing with you, like whether there's an actual serial killer on the loose or the details of certain things. And you're not at an age where you're reading the paper from cover to cover. You're just going to the comics page. But you can't help but absorb this extra sense of there's danger around, don't wander here, don't be alone here, be careful. And that became what Unraveling is, this idea that you have a kind of a very human situation of a murderer, but it exercises such an effect on the general psyche of the country that it begins to acquire a sense of myth. Since then, I have encountered so many writers or emerging writers in Barbados who say, yeah, ma, I write a story about the Heart Man. And I'm like, you and 20 others.
There's a way in which that feels incredibly relatable. I feel that when I read Walter Gray, for example, who one could describe as an antagonist, if not the antagonist of Unraveling, I am never too far from a Trinidadian homicidal maniac. And in that way, the city in which Unraveling is set, though it's not named as a distinctly Caribbean place, and though it's not, our world as we understand it has so many connections and threads. I come back to threads again because I think threads are so vital to the world that is our world, our Caribbean that we write about and fantasize about. That feels incredibly real to me.
Well, definitely the city it was a place for a good commentary. How we deal with the outsider, how we are with the networks that we get too comfortable with, the ways we let people off the hook because we know them. That was, as you say, all very much a very Caribbean urban story. So yes, I was definitely doing that.
It's in creating the city, which feels like, and I think you take care from the very beginning to show us that the place in which Miranda lives and works and is trying to solve crime, it is in its very foundations a deeply non-equitable place. Like there's no sense that the city is a utopia or that everyone is equal and has equal rights. And in that way, the city feels like a true reflection of our real and lived world. And I wonder to what extent that felt deliberate.
It was deliberate because the other question I was thinking about is how much can you change a place when it has some foundationally problematic roots? I'm going to use the word thread now. There's a thread throughout the story where she has a boss and a mentor who knows that he's dealing with a very flawed and corrupt system, but he also feels it can be better. But he's passing the baton to the next generation. He's like, look, I've tried my bit. I've tried as hard as I can within my limitations. What are you going to do? It's up to you now. You know, I've kind of reached what I can manage. And initially, it's almost as if she's going to do that as well, work within the system. And then there's another option. And the option is my query about the Ursula Le Guin story. It is Ursula Le Guin, The Ones Who Walk Away from Montparnasse, where again, you have a very problematic city that's got a horrible secret at its core. And then when people discover it, they have to choose whether they're going to go or stay. And the ones who cannot bear the secret walk away. They understand that all of their happiness is based on the abject suffering of one person. Now, that's a hugely simplified situation. We live in a world, we live in cities, we live in communities where our comfort is often based on the suffering of many others that we don't see, that we don't acknowledge. But, you know, the walking away bit, I never felt fully comfortable about because they still left behind the suffering. So Miranda has to find another solution. This isn't spoilerish, I'm just going to say it. And her solution is, if the roots of the city are corrupt from the founding, we found another city, and the people who need to come to it can come there. So you're not trying to fix what's rotten, you're building something strong, and you're bringing in the people who need to be there. So that was my answer to it. But I went back and forth as I was drafting it. I went back and forth, and then I was like, no, I can't stay with this city. This city's got to sort itself out. Miranda's going to go elsewhere, and she's going to do marvelous things.
She's unforgettable as a narrator, as our Chance and Trickster. I mean, the idea that, again, without giving too much away, that you can have divine forces in a narrative, and those divine forces can be so susceptible to this inherent fallibility, that they can make mistakes, that they do make mistakes, that they are often frustrated and stymied and are not perfect in their salvation, was incredibly moving to me. Because at every step, I think we are drawn to see in Unraveling the connections between humanity and the divine as something tangible, something messy, something open to all sorts of expressions of love. And I think I want to ask if you felt closer to the divine or to the humane while you were writing.
Oh, that's a good question. From even when I was doing studies during my PhD, there was always this question of finding the numinous or the divine in the mundane, and finding the mundane in the divine. Again, this aspect of the similarities being where you don't expect them. So I know people do have different definitions of divinity. Strictly speaking, I don't call the undying gods, but because of their unique perspective on time and being able to see it run forwards and backwards, they are indeed like, you know, a level above, and that makes them an interesting kind of group of people to play with. And I think that sometimes you can have problems when you make too sharp a separation between what you think is holy and what you think is everyday. You know, we kind of tease people about having a Sunday religion, or, you know, just when they go to temple or just when they go to the mosque or what have you. But that kind of, you know, literal fragmenting of our lives, fragmenting of ourselves, isn't holistic, isn't holy. So to bring the holy into ordinary and everyday, so it becomes a question of how well are you treating your neighbor? Have you welcomed the refugee? As well as seeing the mundane and the human, where an undying one offers you a cup of tea to calm you down. These are the kind of things I like to balance, to just see if I can get people thinking to themselves about what their lives should look like in terms of everyday worship being the same as everyday action. Oh my goodness, you got me to talk theology. Okay, well done.
I feel that we can't escape, and I don't want to escape us discussing the actual labyrinth. So there's the tangible city that Miranda lives in, the city that's beset by crime and murder and inequity. And there's also the fact that to try to heal some of this, Miranda must make non-physical journeys into the mental labyrinth. And at this point in reading Unraveling, I won't lie, I was often tempted to try to diagram these labyrinths physically. I failed spectacularly. And I sort of surrendered myself to the divine mathematics of that journey. So I'm very curious to know if in plotting these mental journeys, was it ever a physical, tangible act? The plotting of the scope of what Miranda would journey on and be led in her journeys by, how did that come to be and how would that develop in the text?
So in a way, the labyrinths are a place where both the human and the otherworldly meet. So on the one hand, you can just look at it as this is literally her mental journey. She's a therapist. This is her way of going through her therapy. And it's a literal mind mapping. So everything is a symbol. When she hits a dead end in the maze, that means it's something she doesn't want to face. When she's, you know, trying to find her way through various things, you know, these are all kind of emblematic of actual stuff that's happening in her life. And then, as you say, they're different ones. So the maze is one thing. The maze is the one where you choose a direction. The labyrinth is a spiral. You have one path to follow. It's a winding path, but all you can do is follow it. When she encounters the most powerful undying one, patience, patience has her step on a labyrinth where there are no choices. All she can do is observe and listen and react and understand, as it were, what her life will be like, what her life could be like. And that's interesting because labyrinths in the spiral sense are usually what are used for meditation. So the idea is that you're on a physical journey, but the winding aspect of it makes you think in terms of time, that you go and you return, you go and you return. It's almost like you're crossing the same ground, but somehow you still make progress because you're not quite on the exact same point. So it becomes, if the first one is more of a mental therapy, the second one becomes more of a spiritual therapy, where she has to dig deep in herself and come to terms with what the facts mean. The first one, she's facing the facts. The second one, what do these facts actually mean to my existence and how I live my life? And it really was, and then of course, there's Chance's journey at the end, which was to me just, I don't even want to talk about it. It's too spoilery for one. And secondly, it was like, you know, we had a human traveling mazes and labyrinths for the first parts. And then the last part is the undying version of it, that actually warps reality. That actually like changes everything, not only within the undying, but also for, has like huge echoes and ramifications beyond. So that was almost like you're playing with the fabric of existence in a way, which I guess is a nice kind of spiraling out, because first you get the facts, then you get the spiritual, and then you get like, the actual tangible, this is reality. So, but in terms of physically drawing it out, no, I had images in my head. I had the images, and I could see, as it were, the difference between the maze and the spiral labyrinth and so forth. But I didn't actually sketch it out. I am not a visual writer. I know some people who are very much visual writers. It just stays in my head. It never comes out via sketch.
Now, in fact, I think the concept of maze and labyrinth gained so much more articulation in my mind when I let go of trying to visualize them to a perfect science, actually.
That's good. That's good.
That journey felt like I was making my own maze in the book. And I was deeply impressed by that and moved by that. And there are so many great things I could say about Unraveling. And people who are watching us from all over the world, thank you for being here. Don't worry. If you have not yet gotten your hands on Unraveling, we'll be leaving comments in the comment section telling you exactly where to go and get it. But thank you also for being active in the comment section and telling us your thoughts. We have thoughts from River Dean. She says, fantastic. Isn't it the norm for our Caribbean and global culture? Very moving, Karen. Must read.
Nice.
And we have Cynthia Birch tuning in from Trinidad, who says, looking forward to trying to unravel Unraveling. There is River again says, in Jamaica, we had the 3-wheel coffin with 3 vultures asking for Miss Brown. So I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Show that the synchronicity of how our cultures are all involved in this conversation about death, mortality, and how those narratives feed into each other. There's a very thoughtful question from Reshma Supersad, was wondering if she's on the wrong track, but she's not. The question is, having not yet read Unraveling, and so I might be pulling on the wrong thread, I wonder how it may have been influenced by The Tempest, with Miranda, the trickster, Ariel perhaps, the monster who preys on the innocent, etc.
I was aware when I named Miranda that I was thinking about The Tempest, because she is in a situation where the world that she knows is very small, and she's about to be awakened to something bigger beyond her. So I definitely had that in mind when I named her. I was not following the template of the play for the rest of the book, because so many of the things you see wrapped up, especially the trickster and so forth, that all comes from Redemption and Indigo. And the trickster just kind of has to be there. The trickster is one of those characters that that starts off small, but it has a couple of cool scenes, and then before you realize it, he's like, yeah, actually I'm kind of a co-protagonist now. I hope that's okay with you. So you just roll with it.
Karen, I think you're familiar with our ongoing project, the 100 Caribbean Books That Made Us,
yes.
in which we've been inviting readers from around the Caribbean and the world to talk about the Caribbean books that, whether in childhood, adolescence, or adulthood, have helped form who they are today. So I thought I'd bring that list into this conversation because I'm intensely curious to know which Caribbean book of speculative fiction, nonfiction, or poetry would you say has been just fundamental to you in that way? If it were possible to choose one.
If it were possible to choose. Thank you for that. Yes. When it comes to speculative fiction, I always have to mention Edgar Mittelholzer's My Bones and My Flute. It was assigned for us for CXC back in the 80s. And this is a Guyanese writer. And it's maybe a testament to my innocence that it didn't seem strange to me that a Guyanese writer would be doing a horror story. It just seemed absolutely natural. And then it was actually a hard read for me. I don't do horror. It may not seem like that when you read Unraveling, but I actually don't do horror. So when you're 14, 15 and you're reading this thing about ghosts and you know, sort of like an otherworldly flute that only the cursed can hear and what have you, that thing can go home with you and give you nightmares. So it really had an impact on me. And then afterwards, when I was myself a published author and people were like, oh, you must be the first to do this, I'm like, are you nuts? They were doing this back in the 50s and before, you know. It just seems so strange that I had just full acceptance. I mean, of course, CXC makes sure to have, and this was the early days of CXC, so they make sure to have Caribbean writers on the syllabus. So, but the idea, as I said, that a Caribbean writer couldn't write a horror story, that just didn't even crossed my mind. So I remember it because it has such an impact and terrified me so much when I was a student. But I also remember it because I'm just so grateful that it is there, that it is present, that it is an example of, as the commenter said, a conversation we've been having for a long time. How we have these urban myths, urban legends and myths with all this whole tinge of folklore and this tinge of horror. This is how we process our trauma, perhaps. This is how we understand the things that are happening to us that we can't control. We've always been telling these stories. And just because somebody happened to, you know, publish it in another country and has never seen anything else that we've done doesn't make it the first.
Amen. Possibly wildly apolitical to say, but that's really the response. And it's, you know, as you know, it's a weight levied against so many Caribbean writers across generations, across genres. The idea that when the outside, the metropolis, encounters something that they deem exceptional, you're then the first Caribbean writer to have dreamt it up. And we know by our legacy and the richness of it that truly has never been the case.
Exactly so. And I try to be quite vociferous about it.
I think this is a perfect time for us to move into your second reading. So I invite you to do that now.
Okay, so the second bit is, I read you from the beginning and now I read it to you from the end. And the reason I've done it like that is because there are really just far too many spoilers in the middle. So I'm trying to save you. So I hope you forgive me. But now that we've talked about the characters, I can talk a bit about the trickster. I'm here too, said a quiet, amused voice. Was the trickster. In the darkness, his typically sardonic look appeared softer, closer to something like pride. Chance gave him a small smile. Raising his hands, he cupped them into a bowl and prepared to collect the trickster essence that had served him so well in his task. Let me, the trickster shook his head. No, keep it. I don't miss it now. Chance looked at him and realized argument would be useless. Very well, but you can at least accept this. He did what he had never done willingly before and pulled a thread of himself from the core of his being. He did not have the spider's skill to spin it as neatly as the trickster could, but he remembered the blaze of a fire star and the power of a lightning strike, and he wove his brother a banner of blue light and pale fire. Take it, he said, extending it to the trickster. If a trace of you is to remain with me, then take this trace of me into yourself. Now, if you wish, you can move freely among the undying without depending on your humanity as mask and shield. No undying one other than patience will ever be able to recognize you as what you once were. The trickster captured the stream as it flowed out of Chance and tangled his hands in it, not so much holding it as allowing it to hold him. He glanced up once, the glitter in his eyes more liquid than usual, and returned to staring at the gift. Now we are brothers in truth, Chance wanted to say. But he too stayed silent and merely watched as the trickster breathed in deeply, absorbing the colors. When he moved, the starlight glanced off his skin with a new muted iridescence, blue over black. At last he spoke with warm affection in his tone. Go home, Chance. Chance went down the road to the old family house, the place his grandfather had built, the place where his mother had grown up. The village was deep asleep at this hour, with only the occasional barking dog or restless yard fowl to punctuate the relentless chirp of the tree frogs and crickets. He could look ahead with undying senses and be certain of his welcome, but instead, he chose to let the indigo tint slowly leach from his skin with each step closer to his gate. It was the man, Yao, who lifted the latch on the gate with a light clack and pushed it open. It was with human eyes that he saw that the 3 steps of the veranda were occupied. Palma was sitting there, her form relaxed and unworried, propping her chin sleepily on her fist. She looked up as he approached and shifted aside so he could pass, but instead, he sat beside her and gazed up at the stars shining in the spaces between the leaves of the trees. The details of what had happened at midnight and beyond were already beginning to fade and blur. But he kept the emotions, relief, gratitude, and a strong appreciation for his family. I love you, Ma, he said. Unexpectedly, Palma laughed. What does love feel like to you? She wondered. Yao sighed. He was smiling too. This will be hard to explain. You can tell me anything, she reminded him. He eyed her in the dim light. Her face, as always, gave nothing away. Very well. I can feel the spaces where the threads will go, the threads that will weave your life and mine together. If I haven't lived it yet, it feels like a lack, as if I'm missing something very important, missing someone who's very close. Every encounter we have takes away the space that makes me miss you and replaces it with a cord that links me to you and you to me. Loving you when I haven't yet lived our times together feels yearning and unfinished. Loving you with all our moments accomplished feels sweet, strong, and complete. When you put it like that, said Palma, her eyes shining with tears and pride, why would anyone fear death? Certainly not I, Mother, he whispered fondly, nudging her shoulder with his. She sighed as she patted him on the arm. I was so worried about you. I should have known better. Now go to bed. It's late. He squeezed a quick hug around her shoulders, got up, and went inside. Just past the threshold, he paused, shook his head, and laughed a little at his own forgetfulness. He spoke over his shoulder. We'll talk in the morning, Ma. I have a journey in mind for you. The last thread has been woven, and it's time you met Miranda. She turned her head suddenly to face him, eyes wide in mock excitement. No more vagueness. I will find out who she is. You will tell me how you first met? Chance nodded. I will tell you how I first met her, years ago in the city, sitting on a bench in the shade. And after that, since you know me so well, I will tell you the other story about how she first met me. There we go.
Thank you, Karen. I think
Thank you.
the few seconds that I sit in stunned awe, I think the audience can understand that. So I'm always nod back as speedily as possible. Thank you for that reading. It was from that very section that I was going to ask one of my final questions. I will
Excellent.
still ask it because it is so profoundly beautiful and it speaks to so much of what is at the heart of Unraveling. But before I do that, before I greedily insert myself, we have a couple more questions from our very attentive audience. Audience from all around the world, thank you so much again for being here for Bios and Bookmarks, and let's hear from you. So we have a question from Marta Fernandez Campo. Marta asks, there are so many pathways in the story of Unraveling, and the philosophical and spiritual aspects in the novel. So many profound questions about the otherworldly, the human, fate, and memory. What was the aspect of the novel that you enjoyed the most when writing it?
I enjoyed thinking of the levels of reality. And what I mean by that is there's a bit in the middle where Miranda lives a life that might be. And then somebody breaks into that labyrinth and encounters her. And if everything is taking place in muted colors, he comes in like a bright burst of primary colors. He's like unmistakably different. And there was something about that I just really enjoyed, this idea that it's almost like the C.S. Lewis concept of Shadowlands and the real Narnia. And I think even in sort of the present day world, sometimes you do get that feeling of, I would in fact almost call that the numinous, where you are, maybe you're talking to a friend, or maybe you're hiking somewhere and you see this amazing scene, or you hear this particular sentence in the conversation, and you just get this feeling that thrills you, and you feel more than alive, and the world feels more than real. And something in that moment makes you think that there could be something beyond, as they say, the Shadowlands. So that was what I really enjoyed, just like having all these different layers of reality and different layers of how we encounter reality, and playing with that.
Thank you. We have a question from someone I think who's one of your favorite people and also one of mine, Brandon O'Brien. He says, hello.
Hi.
I was planning to stay and watch. Well, we're glad that you didn't. But I do have one question. Just as the Galaxy game follows from the best of all possible worlds and expands on the universe and its rules and cultures, it appears that Unraveling does the same for Redemption and Indigo, adding more layers of understanding and reminding us of the depth of its world. Do you find that while plotting a novel, you discover these new paths that don't necessarily fit the story in front of you, and come back to them to see where they lead later for another story?
I don't think I've encountered that specifically. If I tell you what I do, it's going to sound a little harsh, but when I'm plotting out a story and there's something that seems cool but doesn't fit, I just like take it right out and it goes into another story completely. It's probably meant for something else. I mean, it's caught my attention, maybe it's really neat, but whenever I write something, the way the world fits together has to make sense in my head. So that even if, I mean, true, there may be things that come up that I think, oh, that's too early to reveal that, or that isn't relevant to explain for the plot right now. And yes, it will come up later on. But the bits that kind of really stand out, I tend to just like separate them completely and say, you know, that's you indulging yourself. You put that in another book. This one already has its own internal logic.
And I will now shamelessly follow up with my final question, which has to do, it has a lot to do with the last excerpt you read. And it's similar to Brandon's question that spans your novels. Mine does as well. I'm thinking a lot of the lovers in the best of all possible worlds, and the sense that I had at the time that they could defy time, the vagaries of fate, of physics, of interstellar bacchanal, to find a way to be together. This passage speaks to that as well, the idea that people, romantic or otherwise, can be connected across impossible odds. And I wanted to know what it feels like to be a writer who's committed to writing about that kind of love in a world that is increasingly strange and often cruel?
It feels necessary. And I will explain to you how that portion of that scene came about, where he's explaining to her what love means to a timeless being who can be at any point of a relationship, so to speak. I wrote that in homage to a friend who had died. And she was about 10 years younger than me. And it came at a very strange time for me because my father, who was at that point, he was just entering his 80s. He wasn't doing well. And we were in conversation over, I think, Google Chat. And he asked me to come and have a drink with him and his friends. And I literally typed to my friend, this is a fascinating conversation, but I have to go. My father wants me to come and have a drink with him. I don't know how much more of this I'm going to have with him. And then the next day I got the news that she died suddenly. And it was such a flip for me, because if you're mapping out how much time you have with people, you think, okay, the older ones, the elders, let me spend some more time with them. The younger ones can wait until a little bit of time. And I had that calculation completely incorrect. And my greatest regret was that she'd read Redemption. She knew the bits and pieces of Unraveling. I never finished it in time for her to read the completed story. So I was struggling with that for a while and kind of almost angry with it. There's always a bit of anger mixed up with grief, I think. But then I was working through that grief, and in working through it, I was just like, this is what it looks like. Our lives are a piece. Our lives are a masterpiece. And yes, I'm going to miss her because there are going to be no more threads laid down. But this is the tapestry that we have, and it's so worthy. And I can rejoice in that. So I wrote that to comfort myself. And if it comforts other people as well, I'm grateful for it.
Thank you, Karen. It does. To put it simply, it does. I think it always will. And I think now is a good moment for us to, for those of you who've been looking at bios and bookmarks from the beginning, you know about 3 envelopes. It's how we wind our sessions down by inviting our guests to choose a scenario for envelopes 1 through 3, and we engage with what's in there. So Karen, your pleasure, 1, 2, or 3.
Let's go with 1. Let's go with 1.
Inside envelope 1. Numerous memes joke that 2020 reads like the plot of a speculative fiction novel. How would you see this particular year and story end?
Has to be aliens. Has to be. No, think about it, right? What we're looking at is a metaphor for the fall of the Roman Empire. So you know that image of the officials waiting for the barbarians at the gate because everything is such a mess. They're literally hoping people to come in and solve everything. This is what this is. This is a a sort of a retelling of that moment in history. Am I wrong?
No, not at all. And I think that when the aliens come, my biggest hope is nothing but that they will find us worthy, not the other way around. Karen, it's always a pleasure to speak with you,
and
this
such
has
a pleasure.
An absolute delight for me. And thank you so much for being here with us, for giving us the gift of your novels over the years. No pressure. I fully expect to be reading you for the rest of my life. And then lifetimes, if we believe in that concept of having many of them. So I hope you have a lot more to say, because I will always be here to listen. Thank you so much to the audience who's joined us. And thank you for the
comments.
Questions, which are so thoughtful and engaging. In our comments section, you'll find links to everything we've discussed. Most importantly, a link to Karen's publisher's page where you can purchase Unraveling and her other novels. Please stay tuned to the rest of the season. We'll be unveiling our full guest list. Thank you again, Karen, and to everyone who's tuned in to Bios and Bookmarks and NGC Bocas Lit Fest project. Stay reading and stay safe. Thank you and take care.
Thank you.